I wanted to welcome everyone and thank you all for coming out this evening. My name is Alex Sloan. I'm an Associate Curator here at MOCA. And I'm really thrilled to be able to introduce this conversation tonight. I also wanted to just quickly draw attention to the gallery where we are. We are currently surrounded by Judith F. Baca's World Wall, and Judy, who is a longtime friend of John's, really envisioned this space as an arena for dialogue. And I can't think of a better subject than tonight's discussion on community, containment and community, the history of Skid Row and its role in the downtown community plan. Judy's vision for this space and for this artwork is to be an instigator for conversation, discourse, and change. And I'm really glad that we are having this conversation here tonight. I wanted to take the opportunity to thank the Los Angeles Poverty Department, specifically John Malpede, who has been fantastic in helping put together this event. So thank you, John. Definitely deserves a round of applause. And Catherine Guides, who is joining us here, the author of the paper. There are different materials both here and on the bench over to your right, so please take advantage and check those out. I also want to say thank you for Coach Crockett and Charles Porter for joining us as well. It's really great to have you all here this evening. And with that, over to you.
Okay. I just went over there to see if it sounded better over there than it does here, because it's very confusing over here. But David Sloan told me it's better over there, so hey, we're going with that. So, well, thanks for being here, everyone. This is a policy paper that we and other people and groups in Skid Row have put together because we've been monitoring the development of the new downtown plan, community plan, for the last 5 or 6 years, and in various ways dialoguing with the Department of City Planning and the commissioners, and now it's going to the City Council. But first I'm John Malpede from LA Poverty Department, so that's one of the groups involved. And but I wanted to let everyone introduce themselves and a little bit about what they do in the neighborhood, starting with Charles Porter.
Microphone check. Is there a trick to turn this thing on? Do I just talk into it?
Use John.
That's awesome.
Microphone check.
Right.
Microphone check.
Number 4. Sound things help me out. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Just you, John.
You want to zone?
Check. Hello. Yeah, there we go. Hello, good people. Good evening. Charles Porter. I work with United Coalition East, a drug prevention program in Skid Row. I'm looking at all these wonderful photos. I think I saw myself in a couple of them. I've been working in Skid Row since 1999, and the work that we do is really grounded in building community, amplifying community voice, addressing conditions that contribute to addiction, substance abuse. But a lot of the work that we've done has not just been about representation as a neighborhood, as a community, empowerment, but also claiming spaces and creating safe spaces and creating programming in our local parks, as well as advocating so that community members are able to be a part of the solutions for the problems affecting the neighborhood, and that includes living wage jobs to address conditions in the neighborhood. I think I'll talk a little bit later about the work that we do, but at this point, just introducing myself. I'm part of the Skid Row Now 2040 Coalition, and the work that I do at USEP over the years had involved planning and land use. We were working to clean up some nuisance liquor stores, bars, hotels, and we realized a lot of the challenges in trying to address one individual use at a time. So we learned a lot just through trial and error, and also how challenging it can be for community members to participate in government. To show up at a public hearing, you might have to be there for 3-4 hours waiting to speak, and you may only be able to, at some public hearings now, the public comment is like 1 minute. So you've been waiting 3 hours to talk for 1 minute, you know, so that's a bit challenging. So also just being able to make systems more responsive and just support the advocacy that folks that you see on the panel have been contributing to for many years, and also just to acknowledge and spotlight the folks in Skid Row that have been fighting and on the ground. So hopefully we can capture some of that tonight.
Kathy Goodis.
Hello. Did that work? No? Yes? Oh, good. Okay, great. Hi, I'm Kathy Gudis, and I am a longtime participant in LA Poverty Department programs as an audience member, as a participant, as a volunteer. Like, I have a saying that once you volunteer for LA Poverty Department, it is a lifetime commitment. The same can be said to be true for being on the board. So I've been lucky enough to also serve on the board of LA Poverty Department. And in the process of doing so, I recognized that people in Skid Row have a keen sense of the history of their neighborhood, the ways in which it has an incredible set of networks that connect people to one another, both through culture and the arts and through a variety of social services that they both provide for one another and themselves, and that are provided by others. I am trained as a historian. I have a PhD in that. I teach history at the University of California at Riverside, where I also do public humanities projects. And so I was really interested in the ways in which we might be able to use history from the ground up, meaning uplifting the voices of people who have made that history, in order to offer a counter-narrative to what we were hearing in some public commentaries around planning for downtown Los Angeles. Now, that planning is aiming for the year 2040. It's been going on since 2014, so we're talking about some slow processes, but also things that are supposed to envision a future, and yet they're very much planted feet on the ground. Yet at the same time, though it's taken so long for these things to get going, we recognized that people have a very dim historical memory. They don't remember how the housing came to be, where it was removed, and by what forces, and the ways in which not only redlining, which we now hear in the popular press, but other forces of systemic racism have shaped the places where we live, where we work, where we travel through. And that's true for downtown LA, almost more so than other parts of the city, because it became a funnel for those who were either disinvested and deindustrialized out of other parts of the city where they had been segregated and were funneled into downtown, where some services were provided but not provided elsewhere. And so we have this unique area to be able to think about. So as a historian, I've been participating in Skid Row Now in 2040. I've been using the materials collected by LA Poverty Department, which include remarkable resources from the 70s and 80s forward, to be able to try to join in, to be part of this larger collective voice of self-advocacy for Skid Row in particular. So that's what this report is related to, not just me authoring. It's not me authoring something, it's me trying to collect the various materials and put them in an order that fits in something that we can convince others is a legitimate body of data. So we've all done that. So I'll pass it over to Coach Ron.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. My name is Coach Ron, the one and only. I've been in the world famous Skid Row community since 2008. So I came here in 2008. I was homeless. I am a father of 5, a grandfather of 4. And so one day when I came to world famous Skid Row, I said, you know what? This place is so artistic, because I'm an artist. I've been a performing artist since the age of 6. I played organized team football and organized team baseball from 6 to 19. So when I actually got here, I seen it was a great opportunity for me to leverage my skill set, my life experience with all my former NFL players and NBA players that I know professionally, that are professional coach. My childhood friend, Jock Vaughn, he just became the coach of the New Jersey Knicks. So he's out there, man, representing Pasadena. That's where I grew up in, Pasadena, Altadena area. And it was just art and trash. That would caught my eye. And since 2008, I just combined them two passions to leverage art and awareness of community responsibility to pick up the trash, to clean up the trash. All our politicians, like they say, the advocacy of why this place is not cleaned up. Where I come from is it's unacceptable to even throw gum wrappers on the streets and on the curbs. I mean, you know, it doesn't happen. But in this community, it was allowed. It started traumatizing me. It sent me to mental health. I'm still in mental health because I'm still traumatized by the neglect that the general public offers to our beloved homeless U.S. veterans and other beloved homeless people that's suffering on the streets. It's about the rain, it's cold, and too many people just don't care, and I'm just truly traumatized behind that. That's the reason why I'm passionate to get out here and do what I do.
Just to be clear, we're all members of Skid Row Now in 2040, which is a group of organizations and residents that wanted to engage with the planning process. And like Kathy said, we've been doing that since 2014. The history of Skid Row is unique. After this, you know, if you guys know Bunker Hill over here, that used to be a residential neighborhood, right? And in the 50s, it was, as they would say in Kentucky, it was mountaintop removal. You know, all the people and the buildings were disappeared, and a nice flat surface was created for the skyline of the world-class city to be the new Los Angeles downtown. So on the success of that, there was a proposal with a fancy silver cover. And if you get a hold of one of these, you'll be able to see it. Generated by the business community, and it was the next stage of what to do with downtown, and that included disappearing everything in Skid Row and turning it over to a consortium of universities that never materialized, and other sorts of things. And when Tom Bradley came in 1973, that had already passed, but a lot of people were upset by it. Not only housing advocates who had seen all the displaced people from Bunker Hill have nowhere to go, not only the people who were living in Skid Row, but also developers in other parts of the city, because the financing, the tax increment financing of the the Community Redevelopment Agency concentrated resources in the development of of Bunker Hill or any redevelopment area that were coveted by other people for their development projects. So the whole thing was reconsidered. There were public hearings. Catherine Morris and Jeff Dietrich from the Catholic Worker, which had been working since 1970 in the neighborhood, they went to the hearings. And then Chuck Elsesser, who was a eviction defense lawyer at Legal Aid, was also there, and they became his client, and with the Community Design Center, they proposed an alternative plan called the Blue Book Plan, because it was humbly had a humble blue mimeograph paper cover. And weirdly, it proposed saving the housing in Skid Row, because no one was going to build housing for the poorest people anywhere else. And so surprisingly, that report was adopted wholesale by the city, and the boundaries of Skid Row were established from 3rd to 7th in Alameda to the east side of Main Street. And that allowed for no market rate construction. So Unlike in other cities like New York or Chicago or something, where what used to be the Skid Row area has been dominated by upscale residents, businesses with the clout to remake it and just not only displace people, but basically disappear the voice of the people that were there if they were lucky enough to remain. That didn't happen here, and instead, the people that were there started organizing, and like Coach Ron was talking about, like USEP has done, like a million other people, some of whom in this room have done, and so a community has arisen that has its own point of view, its own assets, and its own concerns, like why don't city services actually cover this area? Why have trees been cut down, at the behest of the police department? Why have the trash cans been removed? All these kinds of things. And people have addressed that and organized and addressed that in order to get those services back, in order to make the neighborhood one that is decent for the people who live there, as opposed to displaced.
So one of the things that I wanted to highlight, just to the point of Skid Row being a neighborhood, being a community, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges we faced in trying to clean up some of the nuisance businesses. So that's another thing that when we first started working in the neighborhood, our program started in 96, but I started working there in 99. And one of the first things we did were we asked the community members what were the main issues in the neighborhood. So that's the thing, a process that rarely happens in Skid Row, where people ask the community, what would you like to see, what's happening, what are some solutions? And people that live in the communities are experts on the issues. They know all the problems and they got answers. They got solutions and recommendations, but people never take the time to listen. So that was the foundation of our drug prevention work, was the community generated a list of hotels, liquor stores, bars that they said were a nuisance. And so we followed the city process. We learned a lot actually from Community Coalition, who our mayor-elect, Karen Bass, started Community Coalition. So we learned a lot from them around organizing and using zoning to empower communities and hold business owners accountable. Long story short, we documented the conditions in the community. We took it to the zoning department and we didn't hear anything. And so we demanded a meeting with the head of the zoning department at the time, Bob Genovici. And he literally told, it was a group of community members, and we asked them, when are you going to hold public hearings? We want to clean up these businesses. And his response to us was, well, this is Skid Row. What do you want me to do? And we were shocked. It's like, well, what do you do in other parts of the city? No, but this is Skid Row. And so that's a whole challenge of, from the top down, people not seeing Skid Row as a neighborhood, as a community, and like the laws. There are a different set of laws that are implemented. And so we literally had to protest to get them to even look at some of these locations. And one of the points I want to highlight is using that process through zoning, nuisance abatement. It took on some businesses up to 15 years to clean up one business, because the owner would go to court. I can't afford a security guard. It costs too much money to make my business safe and responsible. And they have their due process, but there are a lot of challenges in trying to address one business at a time. But what I want to highlight is that the community members we were working with at that time wanted a better neighborhood. They wanted a safer community. They wanted a diversity of land use. So that's part of what we're talking about. They didn't want just bars, restaurants, liquor stores. They wanted community centers. They wanted green space. They wanted other uses, grocery stores, family housing, a range of things that no one asked them what you would like to see in your neighborhood. And so I just want to highlight that, because that's something that many folks not familiar with, that there has always been a sense of advocacy in the community, people wanting to make the neighborhood better. Another thing I want to highlight is in that regard, there was a big battle. I think the green paper, the green book talks about one of the battles we had at the New Genesis, and that's an example too of there was a nonprofit housing developer on Main Street, and in the wave of gentrification, they wanted to open up in the ground floor of their building a kind of mixed-use place of Great Balls of Fire, I think it was called, a meatball place, but it was a food truck. But they wanted to open up a restaurant, and they wanted a full line of alcohol. And so community folks were kind of like, okay, well, this is a meatball place. How did it turn into a bar? Where did the full line of alcohol come from? It's like, oh, well, to be competitive, you got to sell full line of alcohol because that's what everybody does. And it was a real contentious issue because people in the building were in recovery. It's a subsidized building that houses people that are in recovery. And I think it was a mandate for some of the tenants to actually go to meetings. And so it was kind of like, that was another example of, and they had community meetings, and people said, why don't you turn this into like a social enterprise where it's community business that the folks that live in the building sell things. Like, there were a lot of great ideas, going back to what I said earlier. Community members have great ideas. Nobody listens. And so it got messy. Community fought to keep the place from opening, and even to this date, I don't think there's anything in that space, when it could have been an opportunity for the community to come together and to really promote social enterprise, promote the great work of what's happening in the neighborhood. And so the other thing that I want to highlight around representation and advocacy is the movement to try to create a Skid Row neighborhood council. I was a part of the initial effort back in 2001, and the second effort to break away from D-Link, which represents Skid Row currently, the Downtown Los Angeles Neighborhood Council. And when the neighborhood councils were formed as part of charter reform, and the goal was to increase civic participation. So neighborhood councils were designed to connect people to government who hadn't been participating in government. It wasn't another tool for businesses and developers to make deals before it goes to city council, but a lot of neighborhood councils have kind of been co-opted in that way. And so at the time, there were folks in Skid Row organizing to create our own neighborhood council. And when we went to Department of Zoning Empowerment, we were like, okay, well, we need support, we need assistance, we never did this before. And their staff told us that Skid Row was the ideal community for a neighborhood council. So why doesn't Skid Row have a neighborhood council? It's a very political, contentious issue, and we fought hard and faced extreme opposition. And part of it goes back to this narrative of Skid Row's not a neighborhood, Skid Row's not a community, what would they advocate for? And a lot of the online banter, there were folks like, oh, Skid Row Neighborhood Council, well, what is their platform? More people sleeping in the doorway, more people, like that was literally more people smoking crack, more people. That was the image that people had of what Skid Row is and what a Skid Row Neighborhood Council would look like. And so the voices you see here are to challenge that narrative. You know, we're not the only ones, but people have this really myopic view of what Skid Row is. And Skid Row is not just the tents that you see on the sidewalk. It's the housing, it's the people in the community, it's the network of relationships that are in that area. And a lot of it is concentrated on Main Street. So that's the thing now, people are like, oh, Main Street's not in Skid Row anymore. It's like, well, when did I think Coach Ron lives on Main Street, matter of fact. Last time that I checked. So and then the second battle to break away from D-Link was to subdivision election, and that was real contentious. There was a lot of shady things that went down. They even hired the former city attorney, Rocky Degadillo, to fight against Skid Row having a neighborhood council. So this raises a lot of issues when you think about what that really means and represents, because what we're talking about here is, as John mentioned, there are already established boundaries. We want to make sure those boundaries are respected, that they're protected, For us, because I work in prevention, we look at the public health impacts of land use. So one of the things we've been advocating for is no more alcohol uses within the Skid Row boundaries. We have plenty. If you do a query as to how much alcohol there is downtown, it's way more than the state allows. At one point, the state in the Skid Row and the census tracts adjacent to Skid Row, I believe the state allowed like 27 alcohol outlets. And at one point there were like 270. And so that's just an example. COVID changed that. Few businesses closed since then, but all that to say that when we talk about a diversity of land use, that's an example. It's like we don't just need bars and restaurants and places for people to drink and party. We need other things, and we need amenities that address the existing community that's been there for decades, and no one has responded to them, that people have ignored them. So that's part of the advocacy that we're supporting. Another example, since I got the mic before they start tapping me, is the refresh spot. So if people are not familiar with the refresh spot, that's another shining example of what happens when you listen to the community and when you connect resources with community vision. This was a project designed by the community for the community. The Skid Row Community Improvement Coalition was meeting. Elisa Arduña, who worked at the mayor's office at the time, she saw our fight to try to create a neighborhood council and break away from D-Lane. And she came as a representative of the mayor's office and said, what are some issues you would work on if you had your own council? Because we have some resources, and what are some things that we could address? So in the midst of our meeting, some people in the room worked on another project. We released a paper called No Place to Go. And it just talks about the whole public health crisis downtown in regards to restrooms and the lack of restroom access and how conditions are worse than the refugee camp, bare minimum standards set by the United Nations. Really appalling. The article came out, shamed the city, LA Times, Skid Row worse than Syrian refugee camp. And so that became a priority. It's like, oh my God, what would a hygiene center look like? And so that became part of the discussion. And the first thing the community said, nobody wants to go to the hygiene center. So we're going to give it a name that is appropriate. We're going to call it the Skid Row Community Refresh Spot. And it's going to be 24/7 services. There's going to be music playing. It's going to be the sense of community. All the images you saw earlier. It's going to be this vibrant, like Coach Ron said, art and culture and colors and sound. And they're going to treat you like human beings. You don't have to jump through hoops to be there. They're going to hire people from the community to work there. It's going to create jobs for us. And that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what happened. So if you ever get a chance, I just say Google refresh spot, and it's a space for the community, 24/7, restroom, showers, laundry, place to charge your phone, access Wi-Fi, and connect with other services. But that's just an example of a community solution that is manifest. They see up to between 500 to 600 uses every day, and so it shows, also the need. But when we're talking about representation in this plan, those are the type of things we're talking about, where we have a voice, where community members are able to say, this is what we need, this is what we want. And one of the things, like I mentioned, we've been advocating for is we definitely know what we don't want. We don't need a bunch of dispensaries downtown. we don't need a bunch of places for people to drink. And so, I think on that note, I've covered a lot of, one thing I will say before I pass the mic, I don't know if anyone mentioned IX1 zone. Okay. Then I'll save my comment.
I just want to say one thing. So I said initially that the neighborhood only existed because of activists' intervention with the Blue Book. And as you've heard from Charles, it's only continued to exist because of the consistent activist interventions, some of which were won, some of which were lost, and all of which are ongoing. And the other thing is, and maybe Kathy can talk about it later, there was supposed to be, when when the neighborhood was saved, there were supposed to be, also in the Blue Book, there were supposed to be other neighborhoods created elsewhere that would also have this kind of community and the supports and amenities. But in fact, ever since it was created, there have been efforts one after the other to undermine the community, and that's why it's required that people like Coach Ron organize to clean up the street. So, Coach Ron.
Thank you. Just when I look at world famous Skid Row, first thing when I got here, I started engaging the community to ask a simple question. Let's take ownership. Let's take ownership. I mean, here you got 70 blocks that the city of Los Angeles gave to the community. Here it is. It's yours. And most people couldn't understand that concept. Like, this is community property. And once I got a chance to connect with longtime historians like Manuel G. Mancapito, General Jeff Page, Michael Blaze, Henrietta, and John. They were like, I think like the second day I was here, I went to one of their events on San Pedro and 6th at a church they had. They used to have little gatherings, and that's where I got a chance. OG brought me there, where I got a chance to meet some of the inner circle. But it was just amazing how in 2008 when I got here, you had thousands of people on the streets. I mean, thousands. I mean, literally thousands. And it was just something that the average American couldn't accept. Like, you just can't accept this. You can't accept it. And I just didn't understand how it was acceptable. Coming from where I come from Birmingham, Alabama. And none of that didn't exist. I got here to the San Gabriel Valley, and it definitely that didn't exist. Growing up and hiking in the hills and Altadena and Monrovia and Arcadia, and just having so many friends in San Marino and it's just in South Pasadena. Like, when I got to downtown, it was just unimaginable, and I wanted to know why. Why is this community so neglected? And then I got a chance to meet LA Can, and they went to the UN and they got all this information. There's a lot of information available, why it's here and things like that. But then that's old information. See, that's one thing about world famous Skid Row. If you Google everything up, you get old information. See, we right here, we want some present day, real time information, like today. Why is it like that? Like, why is it like that today? Why is it like that 50 years ago? Like, why is it like that in 2023? When I give tours of the community, and I got all these groups, and they compensate me to give them tours, and I'm not even a historian. I'm not a historian, but I always tell people, I said, you see that Starlight bus tour? Now we got a tour bus that comes through the community. They charge you $38.99 to get on the Starlight tour bus. And they will ride you down 6th Street and ride you up 5th Street. Right? And that's when I said, I'm gonna take that idea and get with the Tourists and Visitors Commission. And I started a clothing line. I sell clothes, I sell Skid Row clothing line, I do a fashion show. Because when I seen that they can make plenty of money with the tourism of world famous Skid Row, why can't the community? Remember, we wasn't getting none of them dollars, right? When the bus passed, it's like 80 people on that bus, and you got somebody tour guide. This is where Al Capone is at, and this is where all the liquor was at, and this is where they filmed Starsky and Hutch, and you remember that character, Huggy Bear? This is where he hung out at, and he lived here, and you'd be like, okay. So with that said, it just helps us to understand that even though it's a containment zone that they gave the community, we have to take ownership of that. We also have to use what they say, inclusiveness, equity. I mean, when they say these words, when they bring these phrases, I'm so excited. They're like, Coach, how are you doing? I'm excited. You hear the words they're using, right? Equity. But we need some equity here. You know, and we need inclusion. Inclusion means resources and creative solutions. That's when we say inclusion. Because too many times, no one wants to come down here and say, you know, we want to do the right thing. And I know people think feeding is right. Catherine over there in the audience, she plant trees, shades, that's right. You know, art is right. Hugging people is right. You know, having patience is right. But you know what's really right? This is what I'm saying. You know what's really right? What? How about a clean place to visit? How about cleaning this place up? People are sleeping in filth. You have more homeless people dying of natural causes than gun violence, than drug overdose. Hey, how about the fentanyl? Well, how about this? How about inclement weather? You know what I'm saying? So these numbers are so tucked under that the average American won't notice. They just think, man, it's just, you know, mental illness and addiction, but they're not understanding that people wants to get off the sidewalk. People wants to get off the curb. People wants to be housed. There's always this notion, no, people don't know. Yes, they do. Now, yes, they do. And yes, they do.
You know, make no bones about it, we're here because we want to advocate for something, right? So when we're talking about the Downtown 2040 plan, what we want is to be able to galvanize more people to be able to support a plan that will support Skid Row and the community members there to create as much extremely low income and low income housing as possible and to create the most healthy and sustainable communities as possible. We know it's possible because it has to be, right? What's a community plan for except for that? That's the primary purpose, to have a planning document. So there are a few things that we want to be able to share with you that are based on what everyone has said so far. One is that the Downtown Community Plan has come up with some ideas that are really drawn from the work of Skid Row Now in 2040 and from the work of other groups who have come together across Little Tokyo, Chinatown, and Skid Row to create a kind of a people's plan with a number of tenets. One of those tenets has been to say, we want to save the housing that already exists in the greatest density than anywhere else in the city, which is in Skid Row. Skid Row's housing was saved in part because of that containment plan that you saw images of on the screen, and that has been bandied about in really negative or pejorative terms very frequently when people publicly say that they do not want to retain the housing necessarily in Skid Row, that they believe that people should be dispersed from Skid Row or removed entirely, either naturally through the forces of gentrification or by picking them up and moving them elsewhere. Those are not sustainable solutions. Those are also not community-minded plans, and those are also not grounded in any element of urban studies that is actually advocating for people and their well-being. And so there is right now, and I'm going to just point to this screen, which you probably can't see it in the back, but the Downtown Community Plan has come up with what's called an IX1 zone, an area where the zoning is intended to support affordable housing 100%. There are some industrial buildings in there, so rather than them being changed in their zoning to become the most highly, thank you. So that represents about a third of the historical Skid Row boundaries. So Skid Row Now in 2040 is advocating that we retain that IX1 zone as a way to ensure that affordable housing is constructed in that area and not anything else, and that for-profit, those hotels don't get moved in there either, right? However, we also acknowledge that there are larger historical boundaries of Skid Row that we would like to respect and retain, but also declaring those places for affordable housing, for compatible uses, what Charles was talking about, for self-representation, which is what Coach and Charles and John were talking about, and that in those historical boundaries of Skid Row, we have 130 years of multiracial community. We have 130 years of working people living there, utilizing apartment hotels, as they were called at the turn of the 20th century, that were intended for working people who might migrate in and out of them, right, who might move elsewhere. In other words, transitional housing. So we want to ensure that that housing is retained, improved, and added upon. There's a slur that's been issued against Skid Row in all of the public comments, including those by Kevin De Leon and those of Judge Carter in the lawsuits around trying to retain housing. And that slur is that, and which is why we said containment and community, right? That there is a community here. It is not an open-air asylum. There's something that happens when you call Skid Row an open-air asylum, or when you call it a ghetto, and you say, if you retain affordable housing, you will be building a ghetto. You will be maintaining an open-air asylum. Now, when people say that, it's coded. The way it's coded is to offer a scare tactic to those who imagine a white middle-class suburb as the ideal place to live. It's a scare tactic that's also aimed to stigmatize and to dehumanize and to displace Black people in particular, as well as other people who are living in poverty. And that it's a way to sidestep what's really needed. And what's really needed are structural changes. We need housing, right? We need wages that will support people to pay rent when they're able to. We need the kinds of welfare that will allow people to live every day, right? Which is not what we have. We need health services. We need employment opportunities. And this is especially incumbent on the city of LA after more than a century of systemic racism. Now, I'm using that as a catch-all, but it is not an empty catch-all, right? We have literally been funneling people into Skid Row, and that includes a diverse group of people. It includes an incredible number who came in the 1980s from Central America because they came here thinking they were going to get asylum status, and they were screwed out of that and became refugees. They had no other support. The churches had not yet set up support for them to live elsewhere or to create asylum, so they were in Skid Row. We still have a large Latino population in Skid Row. African Americans who had been along the corridors of Central Avenue due to racial restrictions, due to blockbusting that kept them elsewhere, also funneled into downtown. And we saw that increase in thousands upon thousands of people in the 1980s. That included families. Over the years that housing was preserved in Skid Row, those families were displaced, right? Thinking this is not a place for families, it's not a place for women. It's been an incredibly violent place for women. And so what we want to advocate is that if we're looking for healthy communities, the goal is not to remove the people who live there, it is to better that community that is in there by reinstalling housing for families, not just single units that divorce people from one another, to actually enact the issues around climate change and global warming and the heat islands that emerge from downtown Skid Row by having green space. And a lot of that is in the existing downtown LA 2040 plan. And so we want to advocate by saying that history has shown us that deconcentrating poverty does not solve poverty. It just moves people from one place to another. We want to be able to say out loud and ask all of you to say the same thing. We're not, no one's been talking about how the solidly wealthy communities need to be diversified, right? We're not busing people into those communities. So why would we bus people out from Skid Row, which in fact includes affordable housing? Think of the numbers for affordable housing. It's somewhere around $90,000 and $100,000 of income to qualify for affordable housing according to the 2020 average median income, right? So if we're talking about affordable housing, I'm sorry, that's pretty diverse if you're going from 0 to that number. So these are among the things that we're advocating for, to be able to retain that IX1 zone, which is a portion of the existing historical Skid Row, to enlarge it to represent the historical boundaries, to claim for self-representation of community members, and other things that John will fill us in on, as well as more that he has to say since I've now hogged the mic.
And that, I think, as everybody, as Charles mentioned, by saying that the good ideas come from the community, as Ron has proved by his actions as well, and as Kathy maybe alluded to as well. It's about representation, right? If there were a neighborhood council, then the people living in the community would be, not only they'd be able to have these good ideas, but more of them would be realized rather than stymied at every possible moment. Charles also mentioned that, you get 1 minute when you go to a hearing. I recommend everybody in this room grab that 1 minute and go to a hearing. And say that you want to have, neighborhoods of low-income people with their own representation to determine their own future, and that they shouldn't be, dispersed and in some, in loco parentis way taken care of by people who have more money and therefore must know better, right? So, that's how when Charles was talking about the New Genesis Hotel, that's how we prevented that from happening, from that hotel from having a trendy restaurant in it, because 60 people from the community took their 1 minute and said, no, we don't want that. And not only did it stop that from ever being rented, there are other important places on Main Street that are also owned by the nonprofit developers who would have been happy to turn those places into restaurants also. None of that has happened as a result of the community voice. So we need you people to all show up to read your paper and show up at the hearing. When the Plum Committee meets, take your 1 minute and say we want this in Skid Row and we want it to happen in other places around the city, which will take the pressure off of Skid Row of trying to deal with everything for everybody.
I wanted to also I see this slide, and it's to the point that John is making about that fight to prevent the alcohol use from coming into this hotel on Main Street. That was in the context of just rapid gentrification. And so this graph just shows just what's being built. And that's part of what we need to advocate for as a community, is that the city do a better job of providing for those most in need. Because everyone knows there's a homeless. That was one of the big issues in the mayoral campaign. What are we gonna do about homelessness? This is just a prime example. If we continue to build nothing but market rate units, then that's a huge, huge issue. We already know the existing problem. And so that's something just, this is a visual that just shows like what the investment has been. And one of the things we've been advocating for, as was mentioned, is creating as much low-income housing as possible to meet the existing need. One other thing I wanted to highlight, and some of the conversations I heard about this IX1 zone, and one of the things that's been really tricky is that it is a city document, community plan. It's a lot of planning jargon. You need people to translate for you. What does this mean? IX1 zone. What is this? But what you don't see is, in the plan, you don't see where Skid Row is. And so there is some discussion about Skid Row and protections for Skid Row and support for Skid Row, but then where is it? And that's been part of the confusion. So some hearings, people are like, oh, Skid Row is this little itty bitty IX1 zone, which is 1/3 of Skid Row. So now, and that's part of our fear, is like, whoa, this is the new Skid Row, 1/3 of what it used to be. So that's another reason why it's like we do have to raise awareness about this, because when you talk to the city plan and they say, oh, well, we don't include neighborhood boundaries within the community plan. So if neighborhood boundaries aren't included within the community plan, how can you protect those neighborhoods? That's something that's why it's important to have that advocacy representation. But also the other piece is accountability, that we have to hold the city accountable. The city has to do a better job. When I mentioned the refresh spot was about toilets, and that was a contentious issue. People were like, oh, well, if you make it too comfortable for the people on the street, then more people will come. It's like just completely ignoring people's humanity. And that's part of what happens when we continue to see the need for housing and we don't build more housing. And so just want to highlight those things that is for us, that just being involved is an opportunity to raise awareness about what Skid Row is, where it is, and why we need to have representation, why the city needs to do more. And the last thing I want to say, in that regard, in the last few years, in the context of racial uprisings and this hot topic of equity, the planning department has really stressed this point of equity. And we want to be a better, more equitable planning department, because we know that our policies over the years have harmed neighborhoods and communities. So for us, this is really a prime example. This is the poster child for what equitable land use can look like, is addressing Skid Row. Because Skid Row is a place where you see the manifestation of institutional racism. It's right in your face. And part of what we're advocating for is some protections so that the future of Skid Row includes people that have been there, that have been ignored for many years.
Yeah, so there's a lot of opportunity to get things right in the future. One of the other things in the plan is, the mechanisms for creating affordable housing are not adequate. So, because right now, and especially but also especially the Central City United Group has done a good job of negotiating with the planning department to get base bonus consideration, good base bonus considerations into the plan, which means if a developer wants to go beyond build more than the height requirements, they have to create affordable housing or something more in their building. But the reality is, only these market mechanisms are pretty much the only ones available for building housing. So you'd have to build like 8,000 skyscrapers in order to get enough, 5% to deal with the people who really need housing. So, there need to be the city needs to come up with other mechanisms for doing it. For example, when they created the adaptive reuse program in 1999, they created this whole feeding frenzy of lofts on Main Street. In the zoning code, each unit has to be at least 750 feet. So none of it was done that way, not in mind of creating housing for people that need it, but to not do that. So that's the kind of thing that has to be rethought, and the city has to come down on the other side of that. And there also, when the CRA was around, there was a way of collecting tax funds and through tax increment financing, send it towards, targeted towards making housing, for example. In 2012, during the financial crisis, the legislature, Jerry Brown disappeared the CRAs, but there have been a few little laws that allow them in different circumstances around the state. Some of those should be addressed towards creating a pool of money that can make housing in Skid Row and like places. Coach Ron.
Well, one thing I can continue to say until things get better is that, I just want to encourage all of us to understand that things can change as we maintain and be persistent with some creative solutions. And, with Karen Bass coming in, Rick Russo, he said he wants to help. So anybody who want to vote for Rick, make sure you reach out to him so he can still support affordable housing. Remember, he said he wanted to help. He wanted to hire 5,000 sanitation workers. So if anybody voted for him in this room, make sure you follow up with him. You know what I'm saying? Because we need everybody's voice. Here we are. We doing the grunt work. We're doing the grunt work. And now that we're grunting it out, quite naturally, we're so satisfied. But it's still, it's just 4 of us so far. But I see more out there. But we want you guys to get on board too. And like I say, we get on board, tweet it out, hashtag it out, get this information, color code it, what I'm saying, and go live, do live stream, what I'm saying, build up the consensus and awareness that, hey, We are the voices of the voiceless. And if we can take on that mantle, that responsibility, we can definitely see change.
There are a lot, I don't know how many planning geeks there are in the audience. I know there are a few. There are some issues around things like inclusionary zoning, and there are other new studies that the city has produced over the last year. One of them has to do with trying to find other means of guaranteeing a certain rate of affordable housing. It has not fully been fleshed out, and it has not been, and Skid Row has not been studied as part of the downtown area that might gain from it. So when you're thinking about what to support with the medley of very confusing studies that are circulated around this, what Charles keeps advocating, and the rest of us are just sort of trying to say, what would Charles say in this situation? It's, you know, as much housing as possible is the goal, right? And that if we get tripped up in the language of the planners, we have to remember that it is the city's obligation to serve its duty, right? In creating a system that will allow that, and we need to keep pushing for it. I think one thing, there are two things that John said, I want to end with the geeky stuff for a moment. One has to do with the adaptive reuse ordinance and the fact that when it was passed, it did not require low-income housing. What a loss. And so the city commissioners went back and they studied this in order to present something to us this fall. They went away and they came back and they said, you know what? It's good. It's good. We don't need to have adaptive reuse for low-income housing. We take it back, right? We'll decrease the size that the units might be, right? Like you can make a smaller unit and still qualify, but we're not going to require people to have affordable housing. Now that's a loss, and it's stupid. It's just so flat out stupid. Now, it's not necessarily the source of the majority of housing possibility in Skid Row, so it might not be part of our 5 points to advocate for, but I'd say that if you have been among the downtowners who've watched the change in the city in downtown through adaptive reuse, that you might want to pay attention to that element that is now coming forward from city planners about not requiring affordable housing, and also questioning whether the IX1 zone should be there, because maybe inclusionary zoning would be better, and we just are not seeing evidence that the work has been done on Skid Row to ensure that. And so that's just something to keep in mind as we move